There have been and are now ongoing three basic transformations that we need to understand. There is the structural transformation of an economy during the process of economic growth, where agriculture becomes more productive but less important, a smaller share of the workforce, a smaller share of the economy. Partly driving that structural transformation is an agricultural transformation. Typically, what we have seen historically are larger farm sizes as labor leaves the farm and migrates to urban employment. It used to be an industry, increasingly it's in modern services. I am a farm migrant. I grew up on a farm and I left the farm to my two brothers. And I went off to do something else because, to be honest, there wasn't room for three of us on the farm. As part of the agricultural transformations, an increasing commercialization of the agricultural sector, we are seeing a dietary transformation, which Vice Minister referred to. As people's incomes increase, there seems to be a very basic desire for greater diversity in the diet, for more animal protein in the diet, for higher quality of fruits and vegetables, and, again noted, much more concern over the safety and the origins of the food in our diet. This dietary transformation in turn feeds back to agriculture, and the agriculture in turn feeds back to the rest of the economy. All three of these transformations are driven by very deep and basic global forces. All successful countries go through these transformations in the process of becoming rich and productive. And look what happens over time and as countries get rich. The share of the labor force, which starts out in poor countries, most of the people work in agriculture. And in rich countries, very few of the people work in agriculture. The monograph that came out of the research that generated this diagram is called A World Without Agriculture: The Structural Transformation in Historical Perspective. In the United States, we have more lawyers than we have farmers. We have more dry cleaning establishments in the United States than we have farms. If you didn't look for it pretty carefully, you really wouldn't see agriculture in the aggregate statistics. You can see it in the landscape, but you don't necessarily see agriculture as an important economic sector in very rich countries. The blue lines are a similar share, but this is the share of agriculture in GDP. Its contribution to value added. And once again, it starts significantly lower than the share in employment, but it too converges towards zero. Labor productivity vis-a-vis in agriculture vis-a-vis labor productivity in the rest of the economy actually diverges in the first early stages of economic development. Industrial labor productivity, modern service labor productivity grows faster than labor productivity in agriculture. That creates real tensions. Even if poverty is falling, even if incomes are rising in agriculture, if incomes are rising much, much faster outside of agriculture, that puts enormous political pressure on the society to try to help the rural economy catch up. We see it in Thailand at the moment, as the Thai government is trying desperately to help rice farmers become better off. I'm pretty sure we're going to hear a lot of discussion about the policy that the Thai government is pursuing in that regard. I'm not going to say I like it or I don't like it. What I'm going to say is it is perfectly understandable in historical perspective because virtually all countries have gone through similar stages. Early on in the development process, this gap widens between welfare in the urban area and the rural area, and any kind of responsive government, it doesn't even have to be a democratic government, it just has to be a responsive government, is going to worry about how to narrow it. When I talk about the declining role of agriculture in economic activity in the labor force, I am not talking about a smaller agriculture. Agricultural output in total rises, and as we approach middle and rich income, high income countries, labor productivity in agriculture actually increases much faster than labor productivity outside. Otherwise, you can't get convergence. The evidence is now very clear that total factor productivity, not just for labor, but for all of the factors of production, total factor productivity has been rising faster in the agricultural sector than in the non-agricultural sector. The notion that somehow agriculture is just inherently backward and can't be productive, it's just crazy, it's wrong, it's historically not true. The difficulty is making sure that with this higher output, that the non-agricultural sector is able to absorb the surplus labor that's left there if we're going to have higher labor productivity. Okay. I need to speed up. This picture simply shows how labor productivity and land productivity have evolved historically over the last 60 or 70 years, depending on the data that we actually have. And it shows both. On the vertical axis is land productivity, on the horizontal axis is labor productivity, and what we see is an Asian pattern where land productivity has to rise if there's going to be any increase in labor productivity because there isn't very much land per worker available in most of Asia. Asia's pretty crowded. It's got small farms and small farmers. And so the only way you can get higher labor productivity is to make sure that the land productivity goes up. Why, if you're a minister of agriculture, if you're a commodity trader, if you're an investor in the processing sector, what do you think the real value of this commodity is going forward? There is a huge amount of uncertainty in knowing what the real price of rice is going to be. And it seems to me, if we're designing our policies, we actually have to simply build that uncertainty into the design. The fact that the income elasticity of demand for rice, what happens to consumption of rice when a household has higher incomes, the fact that that income elasticity is now sharply negative for most of Asia in aggregate has a very significant implication for poverty. Because the poor are the people who don't have the income. They are the people then where rice consumption is increasingly being concentrated. Rice over the last 2 decades has increasingly become the foodstuff of the poor. 2/3 of the world's hungry, according to the FAO, are primarily rice consumers. So what happens to the rice economy, what happens to rice prices, is a very, very big deal for the poor. This is a real challenge for a number of countries in Asia that are trying to achieve food security by reaching rice self-sufficiency. And one way you can reach rice self-sufficiency is get the price high enough that farmers produce a bit more and consumers consume a bit less, and you get that equilibrium at a high price. The difficulty with that approach, of course, is that it is very bad for the poor. Because most of the poor, almost by definition, are not surplus rice farmers. If they have a surplus of rice to sell, in most countries they are above the poverty line. And so most of the poor are net rice buyers, and high rice prices are almost certainly a significant factor in increasing the poverty. Further implications of the structural transformation and the agricultural transformation is that rice is becoming significantly less important economically, not politically. I haven't said anything about the politics yet. But economically, rice, because the rest of the economy is growing so much faster, in East Asia, rice is well less than 1% of GDP now, when it was almost 7 before. In South Asia, it's probably less than 2% now. These numbers are 5 years out of date at least. And in Southeast Asia, which is very heavily rice dependent, probably we're down below 3% of GDP from the rice sector. We see sort of growing import dependence in the last few years in the importers, and growing export dependence among the exporters. This is a very worrisome trend, especially when you put the numbers on it. Asia is becoming a major, big-time net exporter of rice. And where that rice is going to go, if it's not going to be traded internally, is going to be a serious challenge for all of us. I won't spend much time on the impact of changing food supply chains, other than simply to emphasize the fact that about 90% of the consumer's food budget is now being spent on something other than rice. So if countries are worried about food security for their consumers, they have to look beyond just rice. I happen to think there's some really interesting implications of rice moving through modern supply chains because supermarket managers are pretty clever. If it really is the case that consumers would like to have stable rice prices, why can't Tesco or Walmart or Super C or whoever, why can't supermarkets figure out a way to do that and do the necessary storage and supply chain management to be able to provide that stable environment for their consumers? A question of the future. Challenges ahead is trying to understand how food security is under dynamic challenge because of these value chain, I think, a revolution going on. I'll talk more about it tomorrow at lunch. The challenges for us in the room, Sam here? Sam O'Huntys, and I sort of quarrel about how rapidly demand for rice is going to fall. But I think in many of the big countries in Asia, it's not far off, but we still see a pretty significant push to expand rice production, especially in the net importing countries. They're afraid of the rice market, so they want to be self-sufficient, but accelerated self-sufficiency campaigns are a real threat to Vietnam, Thailand, and almost certainly to Myanmar coming on stream. And so what I see going forward as a real challenge for us, and the risk dimension is staring us in the face, is that we've got a thin and unstable rice market with very little confidence and at lower prices for the commodity type of rice. The lessons for the region, these transformations are tough, they're painful. People have to sell the farm, find a new job, move, change their lifestyles, learn new patterns. It's not easy, but these transformations are the only way, at least historically speaking, these transformations are the only way we get rich, become productive, have long life expectancy,